And good morning, I'm Richard Rose. Welcome to Exit 1055 Long Island, your TV 1055 show about all things Long Island. In just a few moments, the debate over solar farms on Long Island is the latest proposal pitting green energy versus green energy. But we begin with, in the wake of the Flint, Michigan lead in the drinking water crisis, schools across our area from New Jersey to Long Island are checking water pipes and school fountains, and in some cases they're finding elevated levels of lead above the recommended limits. The American Academy of Pediatricians is calling for new federal standards to test for lead in schools, water fountains, and homes. Elevated levels of lead can cause serious ailments in the still developing bodies of children.
We know now that even very low levels of lead can cause ADHD, can cause learning problems, aggressive behavior.
And just last week, New York State lawmakers passed legislation requiring mandatory testing of water taps in schools. Joining us now to talk about all this is Glenn Neuschwender of EnviroScience Consultants, and his firm was one of two called upon to check Long Island's 100-plus school districts. Welcome to the show, Mr. Neuschwender.
Good morning, Richard. Thanks.
How many schools did you check, and what did you find?
Our firm currently is up to about 45 school districts throughout Nassau and Suffolk counties, and we've tested close to 500 school buildings.
How many had elevated lead levels, and what is considered to be an elevated lead level?
Currently, our firm is using a 15 parts per billion standard, and we've found about, well, every school district has had some level of contamination within at least some of their buildings, and some as many as 150 to 200 fixtures.
In other words, are they all above the elevated, are they all considered elevated? Are they above the,
Sure.
I believe what you said, 15 parts per billion?
Yeah, the average is running about 15 to 20 fixtures per district, but some as high as 100 and 125, one district with 190.
Well, that's fairly stunning. I would imagine school officials and parents must be alarmed. Should they be alarmed?
I've been surprised by those results as well, quite honestly. I would have thought that in general those numbers would have been somewhat lower, but absent a regulation that has kind of compelled schools to test for lead in their drinking water, this issue has gone kind of under the radar until the recent events that you mentioned earlier about Flint and other places.
And you heard the doctor say there is no safe level of lead, so 15 parts per billion, it sounds like it's not much, but lead is a very serious chemical, right, that can do a lot of damage.
It's dose related as well, so you know, it's not just whether a fixture has 15 or more. So a child's lifestyle can dictate their level of exposure. Does he drink from that fountain often? Is it a level of 20 parts per billion, or do you drink from that fountain once a month and it's 75 parts per billion? So there's a lot of dynamics involved in assessing the risk.
Where are you finding the lead? Where's it coming from?
In a preponderance of the fixtures, I would say over 90 to 95% of the lead contamination source is the fixture itself, the bubbler, the fountain, or the sink faucet.
So is it the entire pipe system that has lead leaching, or is it just one particular component?
Yeah, generally not the case that it's the lead pipe in the fixture or the solder, but behind the wall, but the fixture itself.
What do you do in this case?
In almost all instances, it's simply a matter of swapping out the fixture and replacing it with one that's certified as lead-free.
Now, you know, Long Island is a place that was built in the 50s and 60s. We have infrastructure that's well over 50 years old. What is this going to do to the schools if we find that there has to be a replacement of the piping system?
Yeah, believe it or not, there's a number of factors that will reduce the exposure, scaling primarily in older buildings. The worst offender of a building that we've had was actually constructed in 1969. So vintage, not necessarily the #1 cause of the presence of lead in drinking water.
So what is your firm doing further now on this?
We assist school districts, #1, in undertaking a testing program that's compliant with the EPA guidelines for assessing drinking water in schools. Once we conduct the sampling and get the results back, we assist in determining the root cause of the contamination, the fixture, the piping associated with that fixture, sink, bubbler, or the piping in the building itself.
Now compare the standard you're using of 15 parts per billion to what the federal standard. Is that the federal standard?
Sure. Well, the EPA recommends the standard of 20 parts per billion in schools and a 15 parts per billion standard in public water supplies, or for schools that have their own well. So we've deferred to 15 for a number of reasons. One, New York City and New Jersey are going to be using that standard. The EPA itself references that standard for residential exposures, and while we don't know yet about the contents of the Commissioner of Education's and Health's proposal for setting standards, that law just recently passed last week, We do expect that the number will be no lower than 15, and so our clients will be protected by that standard.
So you're definitely going to err on the side of safety here and go with the lowest possible standard, but some people say it should be 0. Is it possible to eliminate all the lead?
Almost impossible. We do see that in buildings where we test, a number of fixtures come out below 5 parts per billion, meaning that the water coming into their school building is already lead-free, and that the influence of the solder or the pipe in the building is minute, or the fixture. And where we have 15 or 20, there's a lot of different factors that can influence what that number changing from day to day, primarily water chemistry, things like alkalinity and pH. So we try not to get too wrapped up in the 15 to 20, and there's very few fixtures that fall within that range. Most of our exceedances are well beyond that number.
Now, you found some that were quite high. You said 150 parts per billion. Where were those found?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that we've had results that have been in the hundreds of parts per billion. And
hundreds?
And some as high as 1,800 parts per billion.
Where was that?
In school districts, in water fountains that these children use. Sometimes these fixtures can sit for long periods of time and due to inactivity can have elevated levels. In other words, the leaching process continues. If the water is not used, then the result will be elevated. Sometimes it's a function of the water chemistry that I mentioned earlier, and sometimes it's a function of the percentage of lead within that fixture.
Well, 1,800 parts per billion, that just, I'm not a scientist, but that sounds like a shockingly high amount. I would think that system, was it immediately replaced?
Absolutely. You know, on the spectrum of lead contamination, where we would probably assess lead paint and chip ingestion as the highest risk and lead dust inhalation is somewhere in the middle, water ingestion and lead is probably lower on the spectrum, but that said, there is no safe level for lead exposure.
So are these water fountains safe in our schools?
Well, the ones that we've tested that have fallen below the standard are.
Right, and then the others are being remedied.
Yeah, it's a lifestyle issue too. And, in 2016, it's not uncommon that children get sent to school with their own personal water bottles, and maybe water fountain fixtures don't serve the purpose that they might have served when you and I went to school. But there's also a socioeconomic component to this, and that is in areas where they don't have the resources to perform the testing, where a lot of these districts are doing it voluntarily, those schools go unchecked currently.
Well, and of course it can sit in the tank for a while, right? So if you're the first person in the morning turning on the water cooler, you might get that elevated level.
That's right, and those levels will drop off as the day goes on.
Well, what about paying for this? There would seem to be some not exact promise from the state lawmakers that they would help to pay for this. Are school districts worried they're not going to be able to afford to fix this problem?
Big challenge for school districts right now. Number one, they're at the end of their budget cycle. All school districts wind down their budgeting at June 30th of this year, and so their resources weren't really there to conduct this sampling at the end of the year, but most districts have found it, and they're looking to Albany to reimburse them as...
Well, alarm bells are ringing. Now what happened in Flint has come home to be something we need to deal with. Glenn Neuschwender with EnviroScience Consultants. Thanks for sharing the latest results on lead in our pipes and our schools.
Thanks, Richard.
And up next...